Hello class, this is your professor, Dr. Brian Lippincott, and I'm going to give you a little talk about Jung and what Christians can learn from Jung. I'm the author of the book, Analytical Psychology and Family Systems, Neo-Jungian Practice to Help Families Find Flow. I'm a professor of psychology at the John F. Kennedy School of Psychology at National University. I'm a flow neuroscience coach, a clinical psychologist, and a marriage family therapist. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to talk about Jung and Christianity. Thank you very much. Okay, here we go. Jungian Scaffolding for a Vitalized Faith, Integrating Depth Psychology and Christian Theology. Welcome, I'm Dr. Brian Lippincott. In this masterclass, we step into the architecture of the soul, exploring how Jung's metapsychology doesn't oppose faith, but provides the scaffolding to deepen, embody, and revitalize it. So it's revitalizing the faith. Very interesting. Why should Christians read Jung? Why bother with a psychiatrist deceased for more than 50 years who wrote in a European context and whose approach is used by a minority of mental health practitioners? There are those, Christians included, who reject Jung as politically naive, individualistic, psychologically reductionistic, morally ambiguous, elitist, and Gnostic. His view as women has been dismissed as essentialist and stereotyped. In some circles, his psychology is relegated to the occult or disparaged as New Age. He did invent the word New Age. Other problems for many in Jung's strange language of the collective unconscious, synchronicity, and alchemy. His theory, some argue, is a rival religion that assumes an unfallen human nature, so mired in the morass of subjectivism that the life, death, and resurrection of Christ has no objective meaning. So that's what some people say. So let's dive in and find out what Jung really said. The problem: modern Christianity often defaults to abstract dogma, an airy-fairy ethereal faith existing only in the intellect without tissue or aliveness. So we submit that Jung is best understood in the context of the complex web of interrelationships between modernity, religion, and psychology. Neither psychology as a discipline nor religion in individuals and institutions function in a social vacuum. Both have been profoundly shaped by the search in the past millennium for self-evident truths to replace the arbitrary authority of monarchs or divine revelation. In contrast to feudalism and medievalism, modernity highlights the significance of individual freedom, uniqueness, worth, sufficiency, and creativity. It elevated the role of an ahistorical, acontextual, pre-propositional rationality in order to create societal coherence and avoid a repetition of the debacle of the religious wars. Modernity articulated in a linear, instrumental reason for the emerging industrial society, while Romanticism enacted to industrialization by sacralizing experience. In this context, modern psychology emerged, and Jung is part of it. Now the solution: Jungian psychology acts as a prophylactic against abstract faith. It makes it real, it makes it embodied. While some might say that Jung capitulated to modernism, I suggest that he engaged in a pastoral attempt to counter the personally debilitating effects of modernity. Like a pastor, Jung reflected on the psychological condition of the modern individual from a cultural perspective, and also on the state of European civilization with a concern for its healing. Since the modern psyche proved unable to contain mystery, ambiguity, and contradiction, Jung not only elucidated these psychological states in therapy, but he also incorporated them into his theory of the person. He countered the modern tendencies to split the individual from culture and rational from the irrational. Unlike many moderns, contemporary people, Jung actually valued past wisdom and non-Western ways of thinking. Jung responded prophetically to the hubris of the Enlightenment, foundationalism, and its obsession with certitude. So, scaffolding as integration. Psychology is not the edifice of God. It is the scaffold we use to build our capacity to experience the divine in the messiness and dirt of concrete human existence. So here's the scaffolding and here's the dirt of human existence. The religious psyche. The soul is naively religious, repressing this instinct, which Jung believed it was religion was an instinct. It displaces it into the finite objects, breeding egomania and sickness. Over the past 5 centuries, the religious language used to describe the self has shifted from the medieval psyche to the modern psyche, which is explained without the use of religious discourse. Modern psychology can be considered the religious psyche. And by most people, modern psychology is not considered anything having to do with religion. But for Jung, spirituality was integral to personhood. But few took notice of his insistence on this. While Freud construed libido as sexual energy, Jung viewed libido as noumena, which is Greek for spirit. He investigated the psychological meaning of the Lord's Supper, the Trinity, and theodicy. He pointed to the psychological effects of the numinous and the spiritual power of the symbolic images and ritual. Jung was concerned with the repository of psychologically significant religious images and symbols in the collective human reservoir that had reached a low ebb in the 20th century. His reaction was to develop a psychology that would help to reestablish connection to the truths of religious symbols by finding their equivalents in our own psychic experience. Neurosis for Jung not only include not taking seriously the religious instinct of the psyche, resulting in a loss of meaning. It was Jung who, in the conversation with the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, suggested that alcoholism was a spiritual issue. Jung warned therapists of the presence and power of evil in the context of culture and psychotherapy. Jung's fundamental openness to spirituality and to religious traditions encourages therapists to mine spirituality. He speaks our language, the religious language, the cure of the soul. Jung experienced a duality in his later academic education that paralleled his childhood religious experiences. His professors thoroughly believed in a positivistic science. It was in this context that Jung came to appreciate the empirical sciences which informed his early work with clinical case histories, diagnoses, and the formalization of projective tests. He developed a word association test in the early 1900 to 1908. He studied that. Contrasting the positivistic philosophy was Romanticism, the rise of which offered Jung a rich alternative that catered to the more spiritual elements of his personality. He also, in 1909, went to America and had a meeting at a conference with William James, who wrote the book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and they went to a seance together, which I have another video of. The plural psyche. The soul is not a monolithic rational ego. It is a complex, divided inner congregation of autonomous parts, wounds, and forces. And this is very similar to what nowadays, in 2026, we would call internal family systems. There are all these fragmented parts, exiles and warriors, and people, parts of ourselves that are separated, and we have to see them as a family system. Otherness in the psyche, confronting the self as objective, transcendent center of wholeness that is entirely other to the ego. That's the otherness. The internal plurality leads to another pressing pastoral issue that Jung raises: the place of otherness within the psyche. Otherness can simply be defined as those elements of experience that escape the grasp of the comprehending ego. Otherness eludes conceptualization, yet is fundamental to human experience. The modern ego, however, has been growing over the past centuries. Now unencumbered by tradition, as to God is dead, it reveals in its uniqueness, autonomy, and self-sufficiency that the ego is in control. The other person is perceived as an extension of oneself and as the same. For the other person to be truly different is a threat. The mystery of the other is domesticated. Jung's approach brings back into the discussion in the field of psychology the singular experience of otherness. There is that within the psychic economy, the unconscious, that's the otherness, which the rational ego fails to comprehend. Jung refers to the interior, transcendent power of the psyche, this experience of the not I, as the self, capital S self. The self plays a pivotal role in organizing the totality of psychological functioning. In Jung's words, the self is a construct that serves to express an unknowable essence which we cannot grasp as such, since by definition it transcends our powers of comprehension. It might equally be called the God within us. The beginnings of our whole psychic life seem to be inextricably rooted in this point, and all our highest and ultimate purposes seem to be striving towards it. Critical to the emergence of the self is the decentering of one's ego, a process that occurs when one is forced to confront the unknown parts of one's psyche through dreams, fantasies, and symptoms. The self demands conversation between the conscious and the unconscious, working through contradictions and personal failures. Psychological healing and transformation can occur. This activity of the self is what Jung called its transcendent function. By acting as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, the self allows the individual to move beyond the one-sided of the dominant character traits expressed by the ego. In the agony of living, in the suffering of the contradictions of life, in this decentering of the ego, a new attitude, a novel way of being emerges, which has become more psychologically integrated. Jung stated, "I consider it my task and duty to educate my patients and pupils to the point where they can accept the direct demand that is made upon them from within." Linking otherness with Jung's concept of the self is very important. The concept of the self and its activity as a functioning transcendent offered Jung a useful hermeneutic for interpreting the expression of psychological phenomena as an internal drive towards wholeness and transformation. A hermeneutic is a way of interpreting or understanding of the Bible or other texts. So it's a way of interpreting the collective unconscious, the otherness that's within us. Now, this here is a little chart in this book that you're looking at right now about Christianity on one side and the Jungian term that goes with it on the other side. So in Christianity, one of the things we have is sin and the fall from grace, the fall of Adam and Eve. And that's what Jung called the personal shadow. Turning away from the source of life versus repressing unacceptable, inferior traits into the unconscious. So that's what the shadow is where we repress inferior traits. But that's very similar to the concept in Christianity of sin and the fall. The Holy Spirit that moves among us all in Christianity. That's one side. That's the unconscious, or exactly the collective unconscious. I really believe that we have a cultural unconscious above the collective unconscious. We have a family unconscious above that. And we have a personal unconscious that Freud talked about. Imago Dei, the image of God. That the self is the image of God that the person can know inside of themselves. The Imago Dei is the image of God in the outer world. Our created nature versus the archetype of wholeness that organizes the psyche and points to the transcendent. And the incarnation. What we're talking about here is the incarnation of Christ, or the incarnation of God. That somatic grounding in Jung's theories, grounding yourself physically in our physical understanding. Jung was actually one of the first therapists ever to start dance therapy and movement theory and really believed in the somatic aspect of the unconscious. God entered concrete human suffering. That's Jesus in the Incarnation, versus anchoring psychological insights in the physical body. That's somatic grounding. Is this just psychological reductionism? This is hiding behind dogma here. This is me hiding behind dogma. Is this just psychological reductionism? Is faith just a biological coping mechanism? Does Jungian self replace the sovereign creator? Will the promptings of my unconscious usurp biblical dogma? Symbols over dogma. That's what we're talking about. Provides the medium, the psyche through which God speaks. Symbols don't destroy dogma. They bind us to the primordial depths of it. In response to the criticism that Jung privileges symbols over dogma, we must remember that his deep respect for dogma as a shared dream of humanity, crafted by countless minds over centuries, so he did really respect it. Jung counsels those of us to whom religious experience happens to remember that religio, that attitude of attentive consideration of transcendent factors, also binds us back, both personally and communally. Human experience binds us personally back down to the primal depths of our being, to being as it makes itself known to us. We may never understand such experiences. We may, like Mary, ponder them in our hearts for many years, but we dare not perjure such experiences. That is, pretend that they did not happen, or that they did not strike into us with ultimate significance. Russian Orthodox Archbishop Anthony Bloom says about God, that God is prepared to be outside our life and prepared to take it up completely as a cross, but he is not prepared to be simply part of our life. We must also bind such experiences back into our community, for they loom out of us, and others will ask, what has happened? We dare not deny it, for such a secret isolates us and can even lead to madness. Such consultation with others and the reading of the fathers and mothers of faith and history help us in working over the meanings of the parable that is gripping us, the numinous image that arrested us, the Eucharist that feeds us. Dogma is made up of images spontaneously arriving. Images like the virgin birth, the God-man, the Trinity, the creed, and doctrines, which are chock full of such images. For Jung, image language is not opposed to faith. It is best suited to faith, better than theories. We construct from our conscious efforts. Images come from the whole person, conscious and unconscious. Central to their power to move us is our recognition that we do not invent them. They address us, open us, and bring us with them into a dimension of reality that transcends us. Yes, symbols over dogma, the boundary. The self is not God. It is that within us that knows about God. So the self is what relates us to God. So let's talk about the shadow, integrating the shadow. Fear of dependence. Why don't we integrate the shadow more? Why isn't it easier? Because of fear of dependence. We hate our vulnerability. We hide our need for dependence behind a mask of total control. Faking I'm totally under control. Look at how clean and wonderful. The shadow. The shadow is the sum of all inferior, unpleasant, or embarrassing traits that the conscious ego rejects. Ruthlessness and the feminine, our raw rage, our terrifying capacity for ruthlessness, and our unintegrated feminine aspects into the dark. We haven't integrated all these parts of ourselves, so we're constantly dealing with the shadow. The rule: shadow parts are not dead concepts. They are alive. They press fiercely for release. They're fighting to break out. Look at, they're trying to pop up into this wonderful environment here that we have. So how does that happen? First, we repression. The ego refuses to face its own basement animals. We project. So because we can't handle them, we repress it, then we project it unconsciously onto other people. The unintegrated shadow takes on a life of its own, projected into a spouse, family member, or outgroup. This is one of the ways that wars happen. Systemic scapegoating. Families and communities attack the external target to create a false illusion of moral purity, avoiding their own brokenness by projecting it onto the scapegoat. So we need to watch out for that in family therapy and in communities. So how do you integrate the shadow? How do you heal from this shadow projection? Retrieving projections, reclaiming our badness, acknowledging that the evil we see out there lives in here. Decentering the ego, surrendering the illusion of absolute control and moral perfection. We have to let go of that. The power of confession, transforming abstract, generalized depravity into highly specific situations, owned acts of sin. We own them. The lowly stable. Our shadow is the lowly stable where God is actually born in us. Jesus was born in a manger. Facing it clears a space of innocence where genuine relationship is restored. Structural map, the plural psyche. The soul is not a monolithic unity. It's not a unity. Look at all these little pieces here. It is a diverse assembly of autonomous psychological forces, wounds, and archetypes inside here. Look at all the different pieces. The clinical action, pasturing the soul. And you see it here. The gentle art of acting as a host to this inner congregation. Look at this inner congregation. We're all having tea. All the different pieces fit together. We have the king. We have the engineer. We have the angel. Listening to this competing suffering, bits and pieces. And rather than suppress them, integrate them through rigid ego dictatorship. The ego has to maintain control, keep it to pastor the soul and keep the pieces of ourselves, all the different parts. If you saw me, these are what I call these ego states. If you saw me playing with my little granddaughter, you saw me at a 49ers football game, you saw me teaching this class, you'd think it was a totally different person, right? Those are the parts of my soul that need to be integrated. Consciousness, the third kind of knowing. A knowing that lies strictly in the threshold between consciousness and unconsciousness. Visceral and real, much like the intense emotion of a dream of being chased. If you've ever had a dream of being chased, you know how awful that feels. It feels like, oh, I'm really scared. You really feel your heart pounding. You really feel it. You can express it. Consciousness and unconsciousness. We have to relate to both. Symbolic expression. Our experience of God transcends human understanding. Our little pea brains can't take all of it in. It is only to be expressed symbolically. We can only see the symbols. We can't really experience God. It would be like putting 1,000,000 volts of electricity into 220 volts of our house. It would blow the whole thing out. Bridging the gap. Symbols make the reality of God's infinite transcendence and our concrete finitude immediately felt, demanding a response from the whole person. Yes, the whole person. Yes, the prism. So the source here, let's start here. The source, the living God, objective, transcendent reality. Now that shines on us, which is the prism, refraction. How one experiences God is fundamentally refracted through the unique psychological structure of their individual personality. So each of us as an individual has it incarnate through us, and it creates this spectrum of all the different subjective images of God. We can have the Hindu gods, we can have the Greek gods, Christian, we can have the Native American spirituality, we can have Muslim, Allah, we can have all the different, the Buddha could be in there too, even though he's not necessarily a god. He was enlightened. The work, disidentification and breakdown. Spiritual growth requires the periodic breakdown of our existing God images. We must not mistake our personal image, the scaffold, from the infinite creator, which is ununderstandable. But our self can give us a connection to us and push us, lead us, direct us towards healing. So we have two different types of presence here, large scale and small scale. And they're both mediated by the transcendent function, a natural psychological process where opposing impulses collide, creating a new third way forward. It is a mechanism that allows the living psyche to meet the living God. Large scale presence, the overwhelming, numinous reality of the holy that transcends all boundaries when we experience that. Una mystica here, this mystical union of the world. Small scale present, the daily, tangible experience of divine aliveness found in clinical work, spontaneous dreams, somatic symptoms, and quiet, impersonal moments. We need to develop a vocation, a meaning. There's a real difference between, for instance, I walked up on somebody and I say, "What are you doing here?" The guy's a carpenter and he's building something. And he goes, "I'm building a building. I'm constructing a building." Another person comes up, "I'm constructing a church." And the third person says, "No, I'm constructing the house of God." You see the difference? That's a vocation. Constructing the house of God is a vocation. It's not just a job. Like many therapists have the vocation of being a therapist. The daily tangible experience of divine aliveness found in clinical work, spontaneous dreams, and somatic symptoms, and the quiet interpersonal moments with our loved ones, with our family flow in that sense. Now, this is an example talked by Ann Ulanov. She described this as a luminous abyss. One of the examples of somebody who really had a vocation and really was aware of the living God. Etty Hillesum, a young Dutch Jewish woman interned at Westerbork, which is a Nazi concentration camp in World War II, and murdered in Auschwitz, stands as the most luminous, real-world embodiment of Ann Ulanov, Jungian analyst, her psychodynamic theological synthesis. She possessed no airy-fairy faith. She lived the grueling reality of integrating her shadow and finding God in the literal dirt and horror of the Holocaust. Yeah, she fully integrated her shadow. And this is her writing in her journal. "God is not accountable to us for the senseless harm we cause one another. We are accountable to him." That's what she wrote. Decentering, that's an example of decentering the ego. Instead of demanding logical, ego-driven explanations for the atrocities around her, Etty entered complete religious surrender. She gave herself up to God. "Thy will be done." Holy dependence. She radically decentered her ego, practicing a holy dependence that provided a psychological container of love stronger than the abyss of human evil. So let's look at this. Where does this come from? Number one, the scaffolding. Jung's depth psychology provides the structural framework we use to safely access the exiled parts of ourselves, which again is reminiscent of what we nowadays would call internal family systems, which really comes from Jung's ideas. Schwartz, the inventor of family systems, a lot of it came from Jung's ideas, although he breaks it down in a way that's much simpler. He doesn't have a metapsychology. He has a technique of working with the parts in a family systems way that are inside of our unconscious. The edifice, the construction. We do this vital intrapsychic work look at all the people, so that we might encounter the living God with our whole, plural, messy, and embodied selves. The integration. When the shadow is integrated and the inner congregation is pastored, the scaffolding drops away, leaving a resilient, profoundly vitalized Christian faith. Okay. That's the whole construction. You can see the scaffolding here, the edifice that we've created, the communitas, the community that we have, the Holy Spirit is involved with that. It's all in one. And this is what Christians can really understand about Jung's ideas about spirituality and God. Communal religious traditions hear the voice of God in scripture, tradition, and personal experience. Ann Ulanov is most appreciative of Jung's view of the subjective self. She stresses to a much greater extent the importance of human sociality. Ulanov relativizes experiences by tradition. For her, tradition is alive with images, rituals, and symbols. Tradition expands the ego beyond the narrow confines of its own obsessive needs to include the other. And Christianity is a way to do that. Ulanov is not content with the analysis that simply ends with greater awareness of unconscious processes. Analysis must move us to a consideration of the human other. Only through relation to others, then, can one have any notion of the self at all, and only through concrete personal relationships can one draw near to the sense of the value of the self in abstract dimensions. While Jungians are sensitive to the inner life, their view is global also. Many Jungians would say self has to do with the whole of reality, both within and without, and with the ages, the human history under the light of eternity. That's why in my book, I talk about family flow and how we have to become one. The family has to get into flow, and we have to experience this flow state where we are all one. And that's, if you're looking at it from a Buddhist perspective, it would be what we call no self, that you lose yourself when you become one with everything. Or in the Abrahamic traditions of Muslim religion, the Christian religion, the Judaism, and those Abrahamic traditions that come from Abraham, they talk about that self, that it's not just becoming no self, it's about becoming one with everything, the greater self, with God. Becoming one, or at least experiencing the self, which is that part of ourself that relates and can connect with God. Okay, it's an interesting one for me to talk about Christianity and spirituality, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to say goodbye to you all. This is Dr. Brian Lippincott. I hope you understood how Jung can speak to the Christian psyche and the psyche of all the Abrahamic traditions and all the spiritual traditions of the world. That's where the archetypes come from, the universal ideals, that the myths, the stories, the scriptures that we all have related to in our past, in our histories, and in our self currently. Okay, this is Dr. Brian Lippincott signing off.